"He's still breathing," she whispered, and before anyone could stop her, she disappeared into the rubble. Most people remember that day because of the storm. The sky turned a sickly shade of gray, the kind of color you don't forget. The wind didn't whistle, it roared. Rain hit the rooftops like fists. Power lines fell, trees snapped like matchsticks, and families huddled together, waiting for someone, anyone to help. But the story I'm about to tell you isn't about the storm. It's about a girl, 11 years old. Her name was Emma, and what she did in those few minutes between collapse and rescue changed everything for a town that had spent years looking the other way. Because sometimes the smallest voice says what no one else dares, and sometimes the one who seems quietest is the only one paying attention. They called it the Liberty Sons Clubhouse, sat right at the top of West Hill. You could see the whole town from there, and when the wind picked up, the old flag out front would slap against the pole loud enough to wake the neighbors. It wasn't the kind of place you walked into unless you had a reason. Paint peeled off the siding, bikes lined up like sentinels out front, and the men, big voices, bigger arms, tattoos that told stories without words, well, they weren't exactly friendly to strangers. Most folks in town crossed the street when they walked past. Some whispered stories. Others just shook their heads and told their kids to stay away. But Emma and her little brother Caleb weren't most folks. They'd been coming to the clubhouse almost every weekday for the past 2 years, ever since their Uncle Mark left town after a blowout with Ray, the club president. Emma's mom, Nicole, worked as a paramedic. 12-hour shifts were the norm, sometimes 16. She didn't have family nearby anymore, and she definitely didn't trust babysitters, so she made a deal with Ray. She dropped her kids off after school, quick and quiet. Stay out of trouble, don't touch anything, and call me if you need me. That was the routine. She never went inside, never spoke more than a nod through the windshield, and she always left before anyone could wave. There was tension under all of that, old history, a friendship between Nicole's brother and Ray that ended in harsh words and unpaid debts.
Nicole took her brother's side. She didn't like the clubhouse, didn't trust it, but life has a way of forcing choices. She had 2 kids and one job that wouldn't wait, so the Liberty Sons became the only option she had. And even if she didn't like it, Emma and Caleb were safe there. To the 2 of them, it wasn't a den of rough men or loud engines. It was a second home. They learned the rhythm of the place. Gary, the bookkeeper, always showed up first, sorting papers in the back office. Sean, who ran the garage, brewed coffee strong enough to make your eyes water. Caleb tried it once, then coughed for 10 minutes and declared it poison. Ray sat in the same chair every afternoon, flipping through the newspaper, making calls about parts and payments. And no one ever told the kids to help, but they watched, they listened, they remembered. Emma especially. She had a quiet way about her, like she was always noticing something that others didn't. A few weeks before the storm, she pointed to a brown water stain spreading across the attic ceiling, told Gary about it while he was knee-deep in receipts. He barely looked up, said something about getting to it eventually. She nodded and walked away. Adults didn't always hear kids, but she remembered, and she watched it grow darker every time it rained. Caleb was different, 9 years old, full of questions, hands always moving. He could tell you where every wrench was kept, which shell squeaked, what switch turned on the emergency lights. No one asked him to memorize these things. He just did. That's who he was. They were a good team, Emma with her eyes wide open, Caleb with his feet always running. And on that particular Tuesday in late October, everything felt like a normal day. The sky was overcast, but no one paid much attention. Nicole pulled up at the usual time, uniform wrinkled, eyes heavy from back-to-back calls. She placed a hand on Emma's shoulder before they got out, told Caleb to look after his sister. Then she drove off before they even reached the door. That was the last moment of quiet.
Inside, the usual hum filled the air. Sean was cooking something that smelled like onions and pepper. Ray was barking into his phone about a payment overdue by 3 weeks. Gary had old photographs spread out on the table, black and white images from when the club first started, faces of men long gone. The kids wandered to the couch, dropped their backpacks, and settled in. Just another after-school afternoon, or so they thought. That afternoon, as the wind started shifting and the sky thickened into a heavy blanket of gray, something in the air changed. At first, it was subtle, a pressure, like the sky was holding its breath. The radio, usually playing soft, classic rock in the background, was interrupted by a voice more urgent than usual. A fast-moving storm system approaching from the southwest, the announcer warned, with wind gusts strong enough to damage older structures. Sean turned up the volume. "You hear that?" he asked, mostly to no one. Ray waved it off. "They say that kind of stuff every week. It'll blow past." But Gary looked up from the table. His eyes met Sean's. Something wasn't sitting right. Caleb stood at the window. "The air smells weird," he said, "like metal, like before a lightning strike." Sean chuckled. "You got a nose for weather, huh?" But Emma, standing quietly beside her brother, wasn't smiling. She felt it too. The shift, the unease, the attic stain she had watched for weeks seemed darker now, like it knew what was coming. Then Ray finally nodded toward Gary. "Grab those old files from the attic, the ones by the leak. If this rain hits hard, we don't want them ruined." Gary stood up, took the attic key off the hook, and headed for the narrow stairs in the back. Emma watched him disappear, her eyes following every creak of the floor above. And then the rain started. It didn't begin slowly. One second the windows were just foggy. The next they were covered in sheets of water. The sound was deafening. Rain hammered the roof like fists pounding on a door. The wind howled, pulling at the old wood, forcing the building to groan as if it were trying to hold itself together. The lights flickered, once, twice, then went out. The clubhouse was swallowed in a thick gray darkness, lit only by the pale light squeezing in through rain-covered glass. Phones rang all at once. Sean's, Ray's, then the landline. Voices on the other end shouted into the static. Mrs. Henderson's garage had flooded. Randall's backyard was gone. Trees were down on Maple. Power lines were sparking near Oak Avenue. It was chaos. Ray stood up fast. "We're heading out," he barked. "Sean, grab the first aid kit and rope. Kyle, you're with me. We go to the Hendersons first, then circle back." Within minutes, the clubhouse emptied out like a fire drill. Jackets zipped, boots stomped through puddles. Engines roared against the wind as half the Liberty Sons scattered into the storm to help their neighbors. Only Sean stayed behind. "Someone's got to keep track of who's where," he said, grabbing the flashlight from the drawer. He glanced toward the kids, who were still sitting on the couch, their eyes wide. "You two okay?" Caleb nodded, though his voice trembled. "We're fine," Emma said, but her gaze was fixed upward, toward the ceiling above where Gary had gone. The wind rattled the walls. The building creaked under pressure it was never meant to bear. Emma shifted forward on the couch. A new sound joined the storm. Not the shriek of wind or crack of thunder, but a groan, deep and long, like the bones of the building were aching. She looked up again. The attic stain had started to drip, a slow, steady leak in a straight line. Then she opened her mouth to speak, but it was too late. The ceiling didn't explode, it surrendered. With a sound like 100 tree limbs snapping at once, a section of the attic floor gave way. Beams, insulation, fragments of history, boxes of old papers, rusted bike parts, even an old photo album came crashing down into the main hall. Dust filled the air. The room shook. It lasted 5 seconds, maybe less. But in that time, the past and the present collided into a pile of broken wood and memory. Sean dropped his phone and shouted, "Are you hurt?" Caleb coughed and waved the dust away. "We're okay," he said. They had been far enough from the collapse. Emma stayed silent, her eyes locked on the spot where the ceiling used to be, where Gary had gone.
Sean's flashlight darted across the mess. "We've got to get out of here," he muttered. He moved to the front door, but it was blocked by beams and drywall. "Back exit," he said, already moving toward the garage. Then Emma's voice stopped him in his tracks. "Where's Gary?" Sean froze. The name hit like a hammer. Gary had gone up minutes before the storm hit. No one had realized he was still up there. "Gary!" Sean shouted into the mess. Nothing, only the storm answering. He pulled out his phone, no signal. The towers must have gone down. He tried again, still nothing. His hands trembled. "We should go," Caleb said, pulling on Sean's arm. "You said we should go." Sean looked at the kids, at the wreckage, at the roof still groaning under the weight of the storm. His instincts screamed to get them out, but somewhere under the broken timbers, a man was still alive, or might be. "Stay right here," Sean said. "Don't move." But Emma was already stepping closer to the pile. She knelt, tilted her head, and listened. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Sean paused, and then he heard it too. Faint, a low rhythmic sound. Breathing. Not from the attic above, but from somewhere behind the fallen beams, the back corner, where the foundation met the wall. Sean shined the flashlight there. A narrow space had opened up beneath the collapse, a crawl space, no taller than 2 feet. Jagged wood jutted into the darkness. He dropped to his knees and looked inside. Somewhere in that darkness, Gary was trapped. Sean was a big man, shoulders too broad to fit. So were Ray and Kyle and everyone else who had left. He turned to Emma. She was already crouched beside him, studying the space. "No," he said firmly, "absolutely not." But she reached for the flashlight. "He's still breathing," she said softly, and then she disappeared into the dark. Caleb lunged after her. Sean held him back. "Let her go," he whispered. "She's doing something none of us can." Sean's voice held steady, but his hands trembled. He called after her. "Emma, talk to me. What do you see?" Her voice echoed back, muffled but clear. "Beams, lots of them. They're leaning weird, like they fell sideways, but there's space under them. I think he's under there." Sean swallowed hard. Every fiber of his being told him to pull her back out, wait for professionals, do something safer. But the professionals weren't coming. The storm had the whole town locked down, and Gary had minutes, maybe less. Outside, the rain kept pounding like a war drum, but inside the crawl space, Emma moved slowly, her elbows scraping against broken wood as she held the flashlight between her teeth. Her breathing was steady, focused. The beam of light danced across the collapsed beams, the torn insulation, and then landed on a figure, Gary. He was pinned beneath 2 thick joists, his face pale, a cut above his eyebrow still bleeding. His eyes fluttered open at the sound of her voice. "Gary," Emma said gently, crawling closer. "It's me, Emma. I'm here." He groaned, tried to move, then winced in pain. "Don't move," she said quickly. "Just stay still. Help is coming." She wasn't sure that was true yet, but she remembered what her mother had once told her after a tough night on the job. When someone's trapped, you keep them talking, keep them present, let them believe they're not alone. So she took his hand. It was cold, damp, but he squeezed back. Behind her, Sean knelt at the opening, calling updates. Emma described what she saw. The beams were angled, not fully crushing him, but heavy. There was space beneath, maybe 6 inches, enough to breathe, not enough to escape. Gary's legs could still move, slightly, but his chest was pinned. He was trapped, but he was alive. While Emma worked inside the wreckage, Caleb was already sprinting barefoot through ankle-deep water. Rain soaked his clothes as he ran down the hill with one goal in mind: get to Mom. 3 houses down, his phone found one tiny bar of signal. He called. Nicole answered on the second ring. "Where are you?" she asked urgently. "Are you safe?"
His voice cracked. "Mom, it's Emma. She's inside. The roof came down, and she's trying to get Gary out." There was silence for just a second. Then Nicole's voice changed. It was calm, professional, focused. "Tell me exactly where you are."
Nicole had been on scene helping an elderly man evacuate a flooded basement when the call came through. But the moment she heard her daughter's name, everything else disappeared. She shouted to her partner, grabbed her bag, and ran for the ambulance. Over the radio, she called for fire and rescue, gave them the address, and said one word she never thought she'd say again: Liberty Sons. She hadn't set foot in that place since the day her brother left the club, since the day Ray stood in her driveway and told her there was no going back. But that day, none of it mattered. Not the old fights, not the years of silence, not the bitterness that had grown like mold in the corners of their hearts. When Nicole's ambulance pulled up in the pouring rain, Ray was already there. He had just returned from rescuing a neighbor. Mud clung to his boots, his eyes locked with hers. For a moment, neither said a word. Then Nicole stepped forward. "My daughter is under your roof, doing what none of us could do. We are going in." Ray nodded once. "Tell me what you need." And that was it. No arguments, no blame, just action. Inside, Emma was still holding Gary's hand when she heard voices, strong, adult voices moving with purpose. Relief swelled in her chest. "They're here," she whispered. "Told you help was coming." Gary gave a weak smile. "You're just like her," he said, "like your mom." Emma didn't answer. She only squeezed his hand tighter. Nicole crouched by the crawl space, her headlamp lighting up the narrow tunnel. Her voice was calm, controlled. "Emma, describe what's pinning him down." Emma answered clearly. "Two beams, across his chest. There's space under them, but not much. He says he can move his feet a little." Nicole turned to Ray, who was standing beside her with a pry bar already in hand. She gave instructions without hesitation. "We lift the left beam first, slowly. If Emma says stop, we stop." Ray nodded. Two firefighters took positions. Nicole called into the crawl space again. "Emma, watch his face. If he grimaces, if anything shifts wrong, you call it out." "Understood," Emma replied. They began. On the count of 3, the first beam lifted, an inch, then 2. Emma watched Gary's face. He winced, but didn't cry out. "He's okay. Keep going." When the second beam lifted, Gary gasped. Nicole gave the signal. "Hold!" Another firefighter crawled partway inside, checked his vitals, and confirmed what they'd all been praying to hear. "We can move him." Emma backed out first, covered in dust and rain, her arms trembling. Sean wrapped her in a blanket. Caleb ran to her and hugged her without a word. Then came Gary on a backboard, face pale but eyes open. As they carried him out, he turned to Ray and said, voice hoarse, "Tell them, she knew where I was, because she paid attention when the rest of us didn't." The days that followed weren't quiet, but they were different. The storm had left behind more than broken beams and soaked memories. It left behind a moment of truth, one that couldn't be ignored anymore. Neighbors who had once walked past the Liberty Sons clubhouse without looking now came up the hill carrying tools and tarps. Mrs. Henderson and her daughter brought hot coffee and a box of sandwiches. Randall's family showed up with blankets and folding chairs, and no one asked for thanks. No one even spoke about the old days. They just showed up. And for the first time in years, the Liberty Sons opened their doors wide. Emma and Caleb were there nearly every day after school. Gary recovered slowly, broken ribs, deep bruises, and a mind still shaken by the close call. But when he returned 6 weeks later, the first place he went was the attic. It looked nothing like it had before. What once was a dusty storage room with water-stained corners had been turned into something new, a gallery. One wall displayed black and white photographs of the club's history.
The opposite wall held space for community memories. In the center hung a single framed picture, Emma and Caleb taken the day after the collapse, mud-streaked, exhausted, but smiling. Gary sat beside Emma as she scanned old photos, labeling each one carefully. "You're better at this than I ever was," he said, resting his back gently against the new wall. "You showed me which ones matter," she replied, eyes still on the screen.
Downstairs, Caleb was helping Sean install a new breaker box. He asked questions, listened closely, and nodded like he understood every wire and socket. Nicole sat across from Ray in the newly finished community room, discussing how after-school programs might run, what rules made sense, and how to make sure no kid ever felt like they had nowhere to go. No one brought up the storm, or the past, or the pain. Those things still existed, but they weren't heavy anymore. They were background now. What mattered most was what stood in front of them, rebuilt, reshaped, reimagined. The Liberty Sons hadn't changed who they were, but they had remembered why they mattered. And all it took was one quiet voice that dared to act when others were afraid. Emma never asked if she was strong enough, or brave enough, or old enough. She just did what needed to be done. And in doing so, she reminded all of us of something we sometimes forget, that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. So let me ask you, what would you have done if you heard someone breathing beneath the wreckage? Would you have paused or moved? Share your thoughts below, and if this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone in your life who listens more than they speak, who acts when others wait, then go ahead and like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to Embrace the Journey, where real courage always finds a home. We'll see you next time.